up that fairly impressive chat is our second speaker or conversationalist for today, a parliamentarian who has for many years proudly worn his love and support of science on his sleeves, the Shadow Minister for Science, Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Industry. He has held this portfolio in government and in opposition on and off for 16 years. There's not many parliamentarians that we can point to who have so consistently and so energetically and with occasional bellicose addresses supported science. It is an incredible pleasure and honour to welcome Senator the Honourable Kim Carr to the stage. Would you please make him feel very welcome? Senator the Honourable Kim Carr, Shadow Minister for Science, Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Industry. Can I start off by asking, can I call you Kim?
You certainly can.
Excellent. That's a great first question. As I mentioned in the intro, you've been in this portfolio on and off for longer than I've been a researcher. What have you noticed? What's changed in that time?
Well, first of all, I'm not in higher education formally anymore. I do the research program. I've got the same job now as I had in government. That's Innovation, Industry, Science and Research. I was the first innovation minister in the Commonwealth. But look, in general terms, I think what's changed over the period since my first appointment in 2001 is that the pace of social engagement has changed. The level of social engagement might have speeded up, but the level of public education has not necessarily speeded up. So I think the digital age has brought with it propensity for anti-intellectualism and a much higher level of hostility from fringe groups who take a very negative attitude to science. And that's been exploited by politically motivated elements who are in fact seeking to promote themselves as champions of the fringe of politics. Now that element arises essentially as our social institutions and social structures are breaking down. There's a profound crisis of capitalism that's developed throughout the Western world as globalisation and the effects of economic dislocation have meant that for many people their living standards are actually declining. So the IMF and World Bank now tells us that the levels of inequality are the highest they've been in several generations, and that for the first time probably since the Industrial Revolution, the number of jobs being created as a result of technology is actually now declining by comparison in terms of the number of jobs lost. And so for a lot of people this is a time of great insecurity and anxiety. And increasing numbers of people in our society are saying that the country doesn't work for them, the economy doesn't work for them, the political system doesn't work for them. And they don't look with confidence towards politicians, to you, the way they once might. Now, I'm a social democrat. I take the view that our role, our mission is to build the new Jerusalem, is to actually argue that we are to create something better for humanity through science and technology. So I'm not arguing you try to stop the rise, the development of new technology. In fact, my argument is that we can harness the power of technology to advance humanity. But something's going on in the way in which we've been able to argue that case, and I don't think we've served humanity very well in the process. So for me, the big change that has occurred is the essential rise of fascism in the West. We try to find nice polite words to describe this, but if you think about what's happening In Western Europe, in the Americas, you think about what's happening particularly like in Britain. In Eastern Europe, you think about what's happening in a country like ours. The political system is not working very well. And it's a great consequence for those of us that are actually interested in social change, progressive social change, is that the sort of work we do is a great risk.
How can scientists, how can experts enter this debate when it's, as you say, it's the experts who are being targeted by a lot of these fringe groups?
You know, there was a time in the 1930s when people actually looked to experts, and, you know, there's part of the political argument about what is the role of the expert. In some parts of the world, they don't actually want politicians. They think that, you know, we don't want democracy. We don't want people to involve themselves in an electoral process. We don't want mass participation. We want experts, because that's the way in which we get over this problem. To me, that's the worst thing you can do. You know, that is a road to authoritarianism. I know what's good for you. And a variation on that theme has been the development of neoliberalism. You know, this global consensus about trade and about changes in the economy, which people said, well, you know, it might not be really helpful for you to lose your job, but we know it's good for you. And you see this develop in the universities, this sort of Chicago school in economics. And so I'm really anxious about the role of the expert. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not to say that there aren't a very important place for technologists and for scientists, for researchers. It's critical that we have access to that and that they're properly funded. In fact, you know, I've long argued that the fundamental principle of Labor governments, and you heard Bill Shorten argue this last night, there's got to be a social compact. You know, we have got a responsibility as politicians to make sure that the resources are available, that we have the very best kit that the country can afford. But at the same time, we call on you to help us solve the big problems, you know, about making sure that we can feed the country, that we can, you know, heal the sick, that we can actually mend the climate. Mm-hmm. That's where the role of the expert is. It's not to pretend that you can argue a case that you know better. That's what leads to a breakdown in the social fabric, that leads to people saying, well, listen, I'll tell you something. We'll tell you, and we'll elect the Mad Hatters of this world, and as we're seeing in the Senate.
I'm laughing about something else. I'm thinking I wasn't laughing. You mentioned funding bits of kit, supporting science. When, if you become science minister, again, what will you do? Will you build on the work over the next 2 years, perhaps led by Senator Sinodinos, or will you have will you take a larger framework, a holistic approach to science? And bearing in mind, it's easy to make promises in opposition. You have to be able to afford this as well. And we're an easy crowd. We just want to hear money is going to flow into science.
Sure. Well, let me tell you this. I think I can stand on my record on this. When we were last in office, we were able to secure very substantial increases for science research and innovation. You know, well over 48% increase. You'll hear some stuff today down at the press club about figures, and it's easy to run figures out, but really be careful about nominal figures and real figures. What the science tables tell you is that and I've just asked Chris in my office to pull them off just on our way over here, because I figured something like this might actually come up, and it's the fact is, in real terms, in the last 4 years, so what's actually happened, not prospectively, there's about a $300 million cut demonstrated in the science tables. Now, every government will spend more just in the normal run of the things if you just apply a minimal indexation rate. But it's the actual real increase that you've got to look to. because, you know, the nature of the way of the world is that costs increase. So I will be doing what I can to improve our financial base for our research. As I say, I think there's a compact. We have to fulfil our side of the bargain. The government's got to pay its bills. So that's a very important object lesson in how things are done. But there's another aspect to it. They've got to actually have firm policy, a policy framework. Now, one of the prime functions of government, and ministers in particular, the science minister especially, is to defend science, to stand up against the anti-intellectualism, to actually ensure the legitimacy of science. Now, you can't say that that's what's happening at the moment, by any stretch of the imagination. The minister was kind enough to say some things about me last night. You know, he's very affable, but he's not particularly knowledgeable. And I think you need to actually ensure that there's a real strength of commitment. Now, I want to see the redevelopment of a long-term strategy. We had one in office, which was around powering ideas. We've got to look to rebuilding our research infrastructure. We've got to look to our research training programs. We've got to look to rebuilding public confidence. And there's particular areas of priorities in terms of oceanography, in terms of space, astronomy, in biotech. The enabling disciplines in terms of nanotech, ICT, these are things that still remain. Now, the pace at which we rebuild will be dependent upon the resources that are available to you. We've made this commitment of 3% of GDP. No one else has done it. A very, very important policy instrument, because that will drive the debate within a Labor government. Now, we, what Bill said last night is, I think, the direction you can get from us as the leader. Now, I think we need to ensure that we have a better engagement with business. And I'm not talking about just a whole series of cliches here. There's got to be a policy instrument to do it. The R&D tax incentive is now the single most important policy instrument we have. It's bigger than we're spending on most of our science agencies. And so the issue there about the premium rate for companies that engage with our science agencies and with our universities is a very important principle. Now, they've got the 3F review. This government's really big on reviews, not too big on action. So we're going to actually see where that goes. That's where we could build. If they actually do something on that, that would be a great start for us to actually take that a step further. But there's a few other bits in that review, the 3F's review, that goes to the question of research intensity and the caps for smaller companies, particularly important for the biotech sector. There's some considerable resistance from biotech firms on those matters. We've already seen large corporations having a funding cap of $100 million and a 1.5% reduction on the rate for our R&D. These are very serious impediments for building the collaboration that people talk a lot about. Very important for you in terms of the application of your research efforts to larger economic benefit. So I want to see those relationships develop without the loss of fundamental scientific integrity and without losing that commitment on basic research. You just got to keep pushing this really hard. There will be no commercialisation without basic research, because you won't have anything to commercialise.
Yep. So you mentioned the R&D tax incentive review as a possible policy that, if adopted, perhaps we'll see what happens in the budget, that you would hope to build on. Science is a long-term game. The benefits of science are bipartisan. They flow to everyone in the country, irrespective of the way they vote, and we would hope that science is supported in the same way by all sides of politics, no matter how they vote. How do you ensure that what you create in the future, you build perhaps on this R&D tax incentive, how do you ensure that the next government doesn't remove what you have put in place? How do you ensure these 10-year plus, these decadal timescales to result in real science coming out of these initiatives?
Well, it's incredibly difficult. It's one of the great frustrations of being in the job. You know, you start a project and you get someone else to open it. I go around the country and I find old plaques with John Button's name on them, and you sort of dust them off and you say, oh, well, this is good. But, and I'm sure there's some of mine around that'll be like archaeological sort of signs for future reference. But I mean, that's the nature of the political process at one level. So, you just have to get used to it. But the real question is, how do you build in a proposition that's going to serve the test of time? Look, the CRC program is a case in point. That was a great Labor initiative. 1991, it served incredibly well. And that's why the restoration of public benefit will be one of the first things I'll do if we get the opportunity. I did that last time, by the way. One of the early days in job as science minister, restore public benefit to research. It's funny how you've got to keep doing these things. So there are some things that do remain to be done again. Look, in general terms, I think that we know that there are some principles that we can defend and ensure are entrenched. I think ERA is one of the great changes that we made that I was very, very pleased with. A program I strongly defend, because excellence in research is something we have to strive for. There is simply no excuse for second-rate research. World best is what we aim for. So those type of programs you can develop, and they do serve the test of time. Now, unless you have long-term planning in your political strategies, you won't be successful in ensuring there's a long-term commitment from the political system. And that's how I approach the job. That's why Powering Ideas had so many things built in over time. Now, the real question will be, how do you actually translate that into funding? Mm-hmm. And why would you just stick at 10 years? Right, the issue here is, and I think Ian Chubb made this point, you've got to get as many of your programs into ongoing funding as you can. There's this constant battle with the men and women of the black hats in the finance and treasury department that say, well, we just want everything on a terminating basis. You've just got to get as many programs as you can with an ongoing funding basis.
Yep. Just a heads up to the audience, by the way, if you're willing, Kim, I'll throw to you in about 5 minutes, so get your thinking caps on. We'll have some roving mics. Something that's actually come up, and it may well feature very heavily in the coming months, is the March for Science. Are you aware of this initiative? There's a worldwide effort that scientists on April 22nd, I believe, will take to the streets and march
Good on you.
For science.
It's a good idea. And you're going to have to keep doing it. As I say, there is this deep anti-intellectualism developing. And you see it, people who are saying we're poisoning the water by fluoridisation. Vaccinations are dangerous. Climate change is a worldwide conspiracy, sometimes seen to be a Jewish conspiracy. It's got a racial element to it. As I say, these are things we haven't seen since the 30s. And it fits this broader social and economic pattern about disengagement, alienation, and hostility. And there has to be a fight back on that. The truth of the matter is what you do is the hope of the world. And you're going to have to defend it. I've always taken the view that science and the research ministers shouldn't sit at the Vice-Chancellor's desk, nor should he sit at your desk and tell you how to do your job. But we've got to provide the framework in which you can operate. That's that social licence argument again. But we've got to protect you so that you can do your job. And the sort of intolerance and authoritarianism that's developing is really what we've got to defend against.
Look, these are interesting times, and we're, for those of us in the media, when we are asked some of these questions, it can become challenging. You can very easily stray into not just politicising the science, but actually being partisan in terms of the
All
science.
right, well, listen, don't be frightened of politicisation. Whether you like it or not, that's what's going to happen. You cannot afford to think that you're above politics. You will be a victim of it if you do not engage. Now, this can happen from both the left and the right. You know, people that get down to the CSIRO and destroy the CSIRO's plant research, to my mind, are just as criminal in their approach as those that try to prevent climate science research. You know, there is this huge danger that we can return to the medieval times. You know, all sorts of witchcraft is out there. And we've got to be able to stand up against it. So I say to you, don't think that there's this sort of idea of that you're somehow or another not part of this. You've actually got to look towards engagement and not be frightened of it. Now, I'm not saying you adopt the tactics of your opponents, but be confident in your abilities and be confident in your capacity to argue your case. Tell me, how many people here have ever heard anyone to say, well, I don't want to actually find a cure for cancer? You know, I'm not yet to find somebody that can tell me that that's not a good idea. You know, I get this all the time when people want to discuss nuclear issues. Oh, yeah, what about this cancer business? Oh, yeah, well, that's all right. You see, so there is this highly selective attitude. And I just think we've got to engage a lot more with people and draw out the contradictions that people are only too happy to accept, let slide. How many people want their kids, you know, run the risk of having their kids get sick because they go to a creche? And because someone else thinks it's bad not to have them inoculated. You know, I'm just a recent grandfather. I can tell you now, it sort of struck me, you know, young lads, off he goes his first day of creche. I hope to Christ everybody, you know, is as conscientious about this as my daughter is. You know, it strikes you really quite hard in those direct personal terms. And I think you've got a reasonable case to put on that score.
So we have quite a bit of time for questions. Oh, wow, we have a lot of questions. All right, where's the microphone? And let's get it to the closest person. And if we can schedule up the next mic in that turn. So we'll go just here from the right, and then if you can get the mic to the person on the left next.
Thanks for an excellent conversation. I was interested to hear you talk about the Mad Hatters in the Senate. So how can you sort of fact check that and make them more accountable while still giving them the ability to speak? Within the framework of politics, how can we?
Well, make sure people don't vote for them is probably the best fact check you can do.
How do you do that?
Yeah, look, you know, you can thank Malcolm for that. You know, he gave us a double dissolution. It's worked out real well. You know, I mean, some of you are going to see Senator Roberts. You'll find out just exactly what I'm talking about. It is extremely difficult to actually engage with some of these people. You know, it won't be done by a rational conversation. You need to talk, I mean, we need to have a public conversation about these issues. And don't think it's going to go away. The argument about climate change is a really serious one. And it's now people are beginning to understand what it means when we can't turn the lights on. You know, we think it's an argument just about gas, or we think it's an argument just about the fact that there's not enough electricity. It stems from the fact that we can't get agreement on how to deal with climate change because there's no investment in the future capacity. And making those connections is the way to deal with these sort of characters. Now, you know, so I've got a pretty strong view about this because, you know, the other part of my job is the industry part of it. You know, and as I say, your work is vital to in keeping people in work. Now, this connection here is really important. And so when it comes to the question of being able to get people to actually have a decent living standards and decent wages, the question of having energy, access to reasonably priced, cheap electricity, which is reliable, is a fundamental question. And if anything's going to bring home to folks in this country the importance of these issues, it's the question of whether or not they can get the lights turned on. And I must say to you, I mean, part of the problem is we often treat these issues as a religious question, you know. We don't, most folks don't really care. They want to know that the lights can be turned on.
Sorry, by the way, if you could say your name and your institution and then your question, please. So just here on the left, yep.
Thank you for joining us. My name is Sam. I'm from CSIRO. The question does not represent my organisation's view. It's mine entirely. I should say that first in case I get in trouble.
We'll take that as written. Yeah.
So when you started, when we were talking about the role of the experts, you're talking about, as Social Democrats, about how, in your views, about your desire to kind of bring forth a new Jerusalem. And then we talked about how the danger of just having experts rule everything, because in a way it's us impressing our ideas despite what other people believe. So my question is, how do we as scientists engage with, I guess, as society, especially with those splinter groups, those minorities who believe in views that are contrary to what scientific evidence tells us? Is there a role for us to, for example, the anti-vax people, to tell them, look, hang on, this, as much as that's your view, but perhaps it's wrong and you still need to do this. So I also want to ask, how do you reconcile that?
Right. Well, this is a building that's predicated on the assumption that people are not experts. And I get this notion of the whole Westminster tradition is that the minister's there to be advised. Just think, I mean, what's the area of expertise you would expect me to have? And then everyone else will say, well, what about my area? So that's your first problem, isn't it? And you start to get to the theory of the expert. And as I say, there's been governments all over the world throughout history that have been made up by experts, and they've generally been bloody awful. So that's not the answer. The question about your role in society is the one that I think applies to all citizens. Your engagement is on the same basis as every other citizen. But the thing is, you should have particular skills, and you've got to bring those to the fore. And you've got to be able to argue your case. Now, there are going to be occasions, I mean, it's very difficult for the CSIRO officer to actually get on a wireless and argue the case. We know that problem. But you've got people that can do it on your behalf, the union in particular. You've got scientific associations. You've got a whole series of people whose job it is to argue for you in that regard. But as a private citizen, you've also got some rights. You should use those. In your organisations, you have a formal capacity to actually influence public policy and public behaviour. So there's many ways in which you can engage on these questions.
By the way, just more facts doesn't usually win the argument. Inspiring Australia on the website has some great toolkits on how to approach those difficult conversations. We'll cross over to the right, and could I have some hands here on the left who want to speak? Yes, thank you.
Kim, I'd like to suggest a relation between what's happening in school education in Australia and the rise of anti-intellectualism and the difficulty that we have as scientists in engaging with an increasing part of the population which really hasn't had an effective science and maths education. So over the last 25 years at least, there's been a decline in engagement in maths, for example.
Yes.
Jeff Prince from the Australian Mathematical Sciences Institute, sorry. So we have had long-term trends, difficult trends in mathematics, and we know, for example, that amongst years 7 to 10 maths classes in Australia, about 30% are funded by someone who's not a maths teacher.
Yes.
And that's particularly bad in low SES, regional,
Yes.
rural areas. In the well-to-do schools, both public and private, in Australia's capital cities, there's, there are 100% of the maths teachers are qualified, but elsewhere there aren't. There's at least 70 schools in New South Wales which aren't teaching calculus-based maths at year 12. So I'd just like to put that to you, that connection between long-term trends and the growing tale of the growing sort of tale of
Yeah.
poor performance in schools in science and maths, with the growth of anti-intellectualism and the difficulty it creates for us in engaging with that part of the population who haven't had the benefit of that education.
All what you say is right. It's and we lay a lot of problems at the doors of our school teachers, perhaps too much. All the problems are going to be fixed by the curriculum. I mean, it'd be a good idea if we actually spent a bit more money on our schools, wouldn't it? So there is, but look, I'm a school teacher by trade, right? So I actually think it's a very noble profession. A few of my children are school teachers who actually followed on the tradition. I think it's very important. The fact is that we've got to actually lift the status of school teaching. It's not just a question of the qualifications, it's the status. 50% of our teachers we train in this country are not employed. We don't provide them with proper contracts. People graduates when they graduate, we don't. We've got a demand-driven system. It means that they've been treated as cash cows where they get pumped through the system, and I think the entrance requirements are not always satisfactory. We're now getting teaching programs run entirely online where students have to even organise their own practicums. We're getting universities that pass students even though the local schools are failing them. There's a whole series of problems with our teacher education programs which simply can't be justified. So the problems are actually much more profound. Now, it would be a really good idea if the government's actually put some particular resources into encouraging people in those areas of specialty that we need. But it won't really make a lot of difference until we actually say to people, this is actually really worthwhile. And that's why I think what's happening in Scandinavian countries, Finland, for instance, is something we should aspire to. But it goes beyond that. It also means that we should be trying to have a better PhD program. Research training program is very limited. We've got to find ways in which we get more people working in industry who have PhDs, so industrial PhDs. So in terms of the industrial engagement, there's more people who are literate in firms. And so there's a whole series of things that we can do. But look, it's not just a question of having people available. The media is also part of this equation. How many science reporters left? The hollowing out of our traditional means of communication. And the fact that the sort of people that are likely to be attracted to sort of Philistinism are often folks that you're going to find really hard to reach. And one of the big problems for the political system is that if up to a third of the folks in this country are just not listening. They're not reading papers in the traditional sense. They watch free-to-air media and just about only free-to-air media. The social media world for them, it doesn't exist. So it's really, really difficult for the political system to be able to communicate, let alone the scientific system, if you like. So one of the characteristics of our age, and one of the great causes of the alienation in our system is this atomisation, the destruction of traditional social engagement methods. And it's not just a question of the school, but it is an important part because the public education system remains one of the few areas of mass socialisation, which in itself is under a challenge because of increasing levels of privatisation. You'll get particular communities where there won't be a broader level of social engagement until you actually reach adulthood. And then it's often only through maybe sporting clubs that you'll start to mix with a broader range of folks. So, we've got a whole series of problems. and it's the social consequences of those, the destruction of that level of engagement will have profound consequences through the system. But the first thing we will really see is the disintegration of our traditional understanding of how the political system works, because we still have compulsory voting and we still have a requirement for people to actually engage. And so the shocks that we're seeing in Europe, you know, are a surprise to people. Well, they shouldn't be, given what we see happening in so many other aspects of social life.
I would also just point out that you can support your school, and I totally agree, by the way, but engaging in the schools as being one of the key places to help through programs like the CSRO's Citizens in Schools and your other efforts. There was a question up here. Yes, please.
My name is Angela and I'm from the DST group. As many researchers here would agree with me, one of the most important tasks a researcher must do is the transfer of knowledge. Yes. And that is predominantly conducted within a university. As many of my university academics around here would agree, there's been a mass casualisation and towards having fixed-term contracts. And before my appointment to DST Group, I was actually an academic within the University of Adelaide and unfortunately had to leave because I needed permanent full-time employment. How will the government of today and future governments tackle this problem? Because we are seeing an exodus of our best researchers to other countries, thus providing a stronger knowledge base for those countries.
Yep.
How do you think the problem needs to be looked at, reviewed and potentially solved?
Well, what's happening in our university system is that the research program essentially has been underwritten by the undergraduate student program. There's increasing level of what I call a moral hazard developing, whereby we're gouging students to fund university research. And the deregulation of our university system will only make that worse. Reducing university funding by 20% will only make that worse. One of the consequences in the demand-driven system has been, of course, the growth in particularly high profit centres, where there's been, in the name of productivity, a reduction in staff numbers and a growth in student numbers, which of course are then funded on a sessional basis, which only makes it worse. So there is a genuine need to actually look at this question in terms of the future arrangements within the universities. It's not an easy task to fix. But there's been a very substantial growth in university funding, and under us, a very substantial growth. We do have to find a mechanism by which that's translated into better quality. Now, I think there's a direct link between the quality that teachers are able to provide, in this whole arrangement, which I think has been overlooked. So there's a few other questions there, and the casualisation of university staff is something that I'm very concerned about.
Would potentially a future government on you legislate?
No, you can't just legislate. It's not that simple. But I have a view that there needs to be established a series of university compacts. That is a funding arrangement with each university. And it's a long-held position that I've had. There needs to be a higher education commission established, because there needs to be a much more higher level engagement with the universities, much higher level of expertise within the Commonwealth. We've hollowed out the education department in recent times. And so there needs to be an engagement about these issues. The Office of Teaching and Learning has been cut right back. There's a whole series of measures that need to be taken within university administration, but at the local level, that is at the university level, there needs to be a pretty serious conversation with the university administrations.
There's my alarm. Last 5 minutes.
Last. I'm Helena from Baker IDI Heart Diabetes Institute, also Australian-China scientists and entrepreneurs. Thank you so much for joining us today. So my question is, innovation is so central to economy, as you mentioned before. Is there anything Australia can learn from other leaders of innovation, let's say US, Israel, Singapore? And is there anything that government could help to accelerate scientists to create the startup companies to commercialize the ideas?
Well, there's lots that we could learn from other countries, and there's probably a few things that other countries could learn from us. I mean, the whole point of the innovation system is that, and the research system more generally, but it's as a subset of that, is that we have to look at these issues as an international system. I want to see our scholars move around, and I want people to come here. We've got to actually encourage a lot more growth in those areas. But we have some pretty innovative programs here which I think we could take advantage of, and I think our R&D system is one of those. But in terms of how do we promote the growth of new companies, there's more work that needs to be done in the taxation system, and there also needs to be more work done to encourage companies to be formed and stay. I've just been to Israel. I had a look at their program. The Israeli chief scientist is actually saying they've been very successful. It's a sensational marketing arrangement they've got there, I might add. They now actually need to take it to the next stage. They're saying that they need to actually think about ways in which they can encourage, and it's heavily foreign dominated there, that is internationally dominated. They need to actually find ways to translate the discoveries and the creation of new companies into jobs. The structure, particularly in Israel and many other countries, is that you have a quick turnover of the company, and so you get internet millionaires or billionaires who don't actually create much in the way of lasting employment. So we've got to find a mechanism to actually encourage that next phase, and that's what the Israeli chief scientist is discussing in the new developments within that country. Now look, this is a different country from the United States, so what happens here will be different, but there are things that we could do. The re-establishment of the equity funding arrangement. We had 4 separate equity funding companies, which the government got rid of. We've got to actually look at those. They're things that actually make money, not cost money. So there are things that we can do, particularly around the question of capital formation, that I think we could learn from other countries. But at core, we are different. You will not be able to adopt measures holus bolus, as you have just because it happens in Silicon Valley.
It's an ecosystem that takes time. We actually have a question back here.
Thank you very much. Crystal Forrester from Professionals Australia and DST Group. My question is, you've been talking a lot about presenting our ideas to the public and to parliamentarians. How do we make sure that we have a cohesive argument? A lot of the conspiracy theories and things have come out because there are actually 2 views, at least initially, within science, or multiple views of the best way forward with some idea or solution. How do we make sure that we're presenting a balanced view that doesn't confuse the public and parliamentarians?
Well, invariably you'll have to be honest about things, won't you? I mean, it starts from there. But don't be embarrassed about differences. I mean, that's a central part of the scientific method too, isn't it? I mean, this building thrives on diversity. So that's not the place to be anxious about. I mean, you've got to be confident that you actually know something about something. That would be a useful thing, I would think. Look, we talk to lots of folks here, you know, and the first thing I say, well, how can I help? Once you start from there, what is it you want? Be clear about that. And I know people say you're not allowed to talk money. I know that's very good, but everyone else does. The truth is you've got to be clear as to what you're asking for. And it doesn't have to start with the dollar question. It should. You know, I had a crowd in regional authority, you know, gave me a whole lot of great stuff, but they couldn't tell me exactly how I could help them. You've got to be clear about that. You're not here to try to persuade me about your latest experiment. You know, I'm sure it'll be terrific. That's not what you're here for. You're here presumably to see what can be done so that you do have an experiment. Be clear about what you want. If you want to get into an esoteric argument about the different strands of thought, in quantum physics, terrific. This is not the place to do it.
All right. Well, with those final sage words of advice, thank you so much, Kim, for your
No worries.
time, and would you please thank the Senator?